Okay, today is September 24, 2013. This is Forensic Interviewing of Children. We're in our third session, and we're beginning Learning Unit 2, Developmental Considerations in Child Interviewing. Your discussion board is going to be about a lot of what we discussed this evening, and this is going to be an abbreviated class. We're going to get out a little early today, but what I'm talking about to a large extent is what I want you to talk about in your discussion board. The rhythm is somehow off here. You should be doing this before I have the discussion, but that's okay. If you can express what we've talked about today and communicate about it and discuss it among yourselves, we've done something good. So it doesn't matter to me that we're going to look into these issues that I wanted you to explore on your own within the discussion forum for your first discussion for 2 points. In any event, that discussion tells you to think about why developmental considerations are important in child interviewing, and they are critical. It's important to understand, where a child is on the development continuum in order to conduct an adequate and competent forensic interview. There are certain abilities that children have at certain ages, and there are certain vulnerabilities that children have at certain ages, and certain difficulties they have in communicating with interviewers depending upon their age. One of the things you need to be extremely mindful of, although I'll talk about at times, and much of your readings for today talked about children's development in terms of their chronological age, there's no strict relationship between chronological age and ability. Okay, these are generalizations. They're pretty good. Most kids can walk by this age. Most kids can speak in sentences by that age. But the operative word there is most. Okay, some may be able to speak in sentences a little bit younger, and some may speak in sentences a little bit older. That really has no relationship to outcome. That meaning. They may be perfectly bright, high-functioning, intelligent children, even if they don't start speaking in sentences till well after most kids do. As Professor Walker says, and I think it's on the slide when we talk about children and language, we interview a child. We don't interview children, okay? And what she means by that is, and she's the author of your book, and Walker, Questioning Children. And what she means by that is we interview this child, the one in front of us. This child has a particular set of abilities, a particular life experience, a particular abusive experience, perhaps if in fact they are a victim of abuse, and a particular traumatic experience if in fact they are a victim of abuse. So all kids are different. And that's why we believe strongly, and I advocate strongly, in what we call an informed interview. There are a few schools of thought, and we'll talk about this later in the course, but there are a few schools of thought about how you should approach children as a forensic interviewer. Because of the concern about misleading children and about suggesting information to children, and the concern about corrupting children's recollections, some professionals advocate what's called a blind interview. That the interviewer know nothing about the kid or the case, but simply go in and interview the child and see if there's something there, to find out what may have happened to the child, if anything. Again, the focus is on protecting the process from corruption by suggestion from the interviewer. The less you know about the case, the less likely you are to have made assumptions about what may have happened to this child, the less likely you are to communicate your assumptions to that child, because you don't know what the hell the allegation is. You don't know anything about the child. So you're less likely to make statements that include your thoughts about what may have happened, or what somebody may have told you the child said in the past about what may have happened. I reject that form of interviewing. I understand its perceived utility, nevertheless I reject it. And I do, and I think most professionals do, for a variety of reasons. First of all, as Walker says, and as I suggested a moment ago, we interview a child, not children. We're interviewing this child, and many children, whether they were abused or not, many children are reticent. They find it difficult to talk to adults they don't know. They find it difficult to talk to strangers. It is a challenge to initiate communication with a small child, okay? When they walk into the room, having met the interviewer for the first time, it takes a while to get going, to build rapport, and to open the lines of communication between the grown-up and the child. Even in cases that don't involve traumatic abuse whatsoever. So kids are a difficult interview to begin with. And the more you know about a child, the more you can establish rapport, the more you can speak to their particular abilities, the more you can address them in a way that is relevant to their level of functioning. Okay? So in a blind interview, you don't know anything about the child. You don't know anything about how they communicate, how advanced or how limited they are. And that would create significant difficulties. The other thing is, we're not talking about children in general here. We're talking about children who may have been sexually abused or physically abused by a caregiver. They may have been betrayed by someone who they love and trust, and who they have a tremendous disincentive to not inform about. So not only is it difficult for kids to express themselves to strange grown-ups, all kids, but it's even more challenging and more difficult for children who have been victimized by their caregivers to make statements about that caregiver in a negative way. So it is going to be a tremendous challenge to interview a child about incestuous and intrafamilial abuse. So what I'm saying in a nutshell is, it's hard to get the child talking. It's hard to get a child who's been abused by their mother or father talking about that mother or father in a negative way. So, once you walk in that room with that child, the deck is stacked against you. It's amazing that we're able to get any information whatsoever from these children, And it's because, I think, in large part, that we do our homework before we go in there. We do our homework generically about child development. The more we know about what stage that child is expected to be at their particular age, the better able we are to ask that child questions that are within their abilities, questions that they're able to ask. Some of you may have done the questioning of the second or third grader or whatever it was. You may have done your assignment already. And I just did the one with the online course, and many children say, I don't know what you're talking about. I don't know what that is. They get very frustrated because you're asking them what an affidavit is, and they don't know what it is. It's a word that's foreign to them. But you're saying, well, tell me what you think it is, and then they get real frustrated again because I don't know what to think it is, And we're asking a child to give us a definition of a word that's beyond their comprehension. I know that they don't know what an affidavit is, but I want you to feel what it feels like when kids are asked to perform beyond their abilities. And in part, that's the goal of that assignment. And forensic interviewers can do that. The best of us do that. We ask questions that are beyond the child's development, and sometimes it frustrates them. But more dangerously, sometimes they give us an erroneous response, and a response that communicates what they think it means. Now, I encourage you to tell them to do that here, but not in real life. We want them, if they know what the answer to the question is, or they have that information, then they answer it. Okay? But what happened here? It's going to be a problem. So, by knowing children's general stages of development and what their abilities are at particular stages of development, we can make sure we ask only those questions that are within the range of ability of that child, right? And we'll look at a chart that's on your, among your assignments that addresses the kinds of questions that kids can answer generally at different age ranges. So we need to know about child development because this gives us insight into their capabilities. And it's almost always the interviewer's fault. It's never the child's fault. We need to ask questions that are within the child's ability to answer. Okay? And we know that from learning what it is. What can kids answer at particular ages? Some kids are better able to answer questions about time than other kids, but we generally know when kids develop a sense of sequence, a sense of chronology, a sense of relating clock time to their own schedule, you know. These are things that kids acquire as they develop, and if we ask questions about when or how before they're able to answer that, not only does the child get frustrated, but we're opening the door for misinformation if they answer the question simply to be consistent with the adult's expectations. So, developmental considerations in child interviewing. I said we advocate that you do an informed interview. You want to find out as much as you can about this child's level of development. And the way that we do that is, and we'll talk more about that at the end of this semester, but we talk to the primary caregiver. And we try to find out as much information about this child as we can. Did they hit their milestones, you know? Are they doing well in school? Do they have some developmental delays? If they do, what are they? How does that delay or whatever condition that they have or whatever issue they have impact on their functioning, on their ability to answer questions? You know, they may have some disability that doesn't impact on, you know, whether they can answer questions competently or not for their age. You know, if a child has dyslexia, you know, I'm not so sure that while that may impact upon their reading, I'm not so sure that impacts upon their ability to answer questions commensurate with children of the same age. But we need to know that, and the best way to try to get some of that information before you conduct a forensic interview is to talk to the caregiver. So you have these general rules on child development, and then you want to find out more about whether this child is functioning consistent with the general rules, right? And that's where the caregiver, the non-offending caregiver, can be a big help, okay? The other thing, among many that you want to acquire, you know, contrasting this with a blind interview. The blind interviewer doesn't know anything about the case. The informed interviewer has spoken to the caregiver. The informed interviewer knows about child development. The informed interviewer knows at what ages children become competent in answering questions and certain kinds of question types. The informed interviewer knows whether this child has hit those milestones. Have they evidenced an ability to answer questions similar to children in their age range? The informed interviewer knows what this child has reported in the past about the molestation. What was the child's disclosure? You know, what did they say? What kind of abuse is it? The informed interviewer knows what the allegation is. And the more we know about the allegation, the more we can think about how that might impact the child's desire or ability to talk to us about that. The desire is they can tell us, but they don't want to. The ability is they can't tell us because they suppressed it or because they don't remember it well because it happened a long time in the past. Or because he held his hands over her eyes during the molest. Or because there was construction going on next door. I mean, as much as we can find out about the nature and context of the abusive incident, the better off we are when we talk to the child, okay? The relationship with the child to the perpetrator is important, right? If the child was molested by the carnival worker who worked at the front of the part of the carnival where the children would go see farm animals, and he secluded the child in back of the farm animal display, you know, that child is going to be more likely to disclose, you would think, than a child who is informing upon her stepfather or her uncle. Again, the relationship between the child and the perpetrator can give us some insight into the likelihood of disclosure and what some of the pitfalls in disclosure might be during the forensic interview. So the relationship with the child to the perpetrator is something you want to find out right away. And as I suggested a moment ago, kids are, you know, going to be more reluctant to inform on their loved ones than they are on some stranger that works at the carnival. But you won't know unless you ask. The blind interview, that person goes in there and you don't know what happened, or what the allegation is, or what the child's level of functioning is. And we know from experience that sometimes you have to address those concerns children have. You have to address the fact that they may feel that they're doing something wrong, or they're getting someone in trouble, or that they did something wrong in the past. And that's the other thing you want to kind of find out when you begin the forensic interview, just before you begin it, during the information gathering phase. You want to find out, you know, how the child expressed what happened to them. You know, were they crying and upset? Did they make any contemporaneous statements? Please don't tell anybody. I don't want to get him in trouble. It's not his fault, or it's my fault. You know, what they said surrounding the disclosure about how they feel about the abuse and the offender is important to the interviewer, right? That's good stuff to know about before you go in there, you know? If they said, I don't want to get him in trouble, he didn't do anything wrong, then you're going to have a tougher time. And we're going to have to communicate however we can that they didn't do anything wrong, and they're not getting anybody in trouble. What that person did is on him. He got himself in trouble. And not everybody goes to jail. Some people get help. Some people simply get psychological counseling and things like that with the older kids. You may be able to discuss with them. So, child development is what this learning unit is about, but not only do we want to learn as much as we can about child development before we interview a child, we also want to learn a lot of other information that I'll go into with you in the future, among which is how the disclosure came out, the relationship with the perpetrator, and similar stuff. In fact, I'll share with you a form that we use in my office that we fill out during the information gathering phase with the non-offending caregiver. And anybody else who can help us understand this child. This child. In fact, I'm going to jump to, because it's relevant to what I just talked about, in Professor Fowler's book. She talks about the research on disclosure failures. And she says, and this is, I think, chapter 13, I forget. You had chapter 10 and 13, I think you had to read. Yeah, this is 13, children who do not disclose. Studies of adults who describe a history of sexual abuse as children include large general population surveys and smaller samples, but all ask respondents whether they told about their sexual abuse during childhood. So, what Fowler is addressing here is, what does the research tell us about kids who don't tell? What do they have in common? Predictors of reporting and not reporting. The literature suggests that certain characteristics predict reporting sexual abuse or failure to report. Again, the question is, what makes kids tell? Now, you don't have to go scrambling through the book. You can look at it in your own time. You're welcome to, but you'll have an opportunity to do that. The question that Fowler's asking is, what are the issues that drive kids not to tell? versus kids who do tell, okay? What are the predictors of reporting and not reporting? And there are multiple studies that she cites. The severity of the sexual abuse, okay? And the more severe the abuse, the less likely to report. The closeness of the victim-offender relationship, okay? The more significant the relationship, the less likely to report, right? This is what the research tells us. The younger age, the less likely to report. One thing that even the people who testify for the defense and even the people who do research that is demonstrative of the vulnerabilities of children when it comes to forensic interviewing agree that most kids don't tell right away. Most children who are sexually abused don't report it right away. What those kids look like, the difference between those who report it right away and those who don't, we're taking a look at now. And some of these things may have a correlation to how long they wait before telling, if they ever tell at all. So again, the severity of the sexual abuse, the more intrusive it is, the closeness of the victim and perpetrator, the younger the child, the less likely to report in a timely fashion. Having a non-supportive caregiver, if the non-offending caregiver, we'll use the mother for example, is not supportive of the child or perceived as not supportive by the child, less likely to tell right away. You know? When kids are abused, they shut their eyes, and I'm speaking metaphorically, I don't know this for a fact, but they say to themselves, based upon the hundreds and hundreds of kids and adults I've met in my many years, they close their eyes, and in essence, this is what's happening. What's the world going to look like after I tell? And if the picture is bleak, if they say to themselves, it ain't going to be good, then you got your answer. They ain't telling. If they close their eyes and say to themselves, what's the world going to look like after I tell, and they see a picture that's generally okay, then they may tell. If they feel they'll be supported, and if they feel that no one is going to hurt them because they tell, or other third parties won't get hurt because they tell, right, then they're going to tell. The problem is most kids don't tell because the answer to those questions are almost always not good. There's almost always the perception that they're going to get in trouble, that they did something wrong, that they won't be believed, that their caregiver won't believe them, that their siblings won't believe them, that they may be put in a placement or in a foster home, or their siblings might go in a foster home or go in a placement. Not in all cases, but depending upon the facts and circumstances, these are the typical things that are worried about by kids, depending upon their age. Severity of the abuse, the closeness of the victim and the offender. You know, I talked about that before. If you're going to inform on your father, you may never tell. Okay? I mean, it's your father. If your perception is that if you tell, he's going to go to prison for the rest of his life, you're going to not tell until you can't bear it anymore, or until some other outcome, potential outcome, causes you to tell. Most typically when you begin to fear that he may be doing it to someone else or your siblings. That could happen as well. But the relationship between the child and the perpetrator obviously is very important and very influential on whether they report or not. Non-supportive caregiver, very important. Excuse me. When you get down to your forensic interview, whether the child told in the past that they were abused, whether they made a disclosure to some other party, is a powerful predictor of whether they're going to tell you. So we look at, and you'll be looking at later in this course, what we call purposeful and accidental disclosures. Purposeful and accidental disclosures. And we'll differentiate them later in the course, but simply stated, purposeful ones are when a child goes to an authority figure or some other person. I'm using that authority figure very loosely and very broadly. When they go to someone they perceive as being able to help them with the expectation that that person will take action to make the abuse stop. Guidance counselor, Aunt Martha, a police officer, their mother, they go to somebody and affirmatively tell what happened with the expectation that that person they tell what happened to will take action that makes the abuse stop. Now contrast that with what we call the accidental disclosure. The 6-year-old who has chlamydia, the 7-year-old who tells her playmate when they're playing a game and touching each other's body parts. She's not going to her playmate to say, hey, playmate, I want you to tell somebody so my abuse stops. She's simply saying, oh, I learned this from my brother. And she begins to perform sex acts, and the adults find out about it in that context. That would be an accidental disclosure. The kid didn't affirmatively go to someone who can help them make the abuse stop. Okay? So you have accidental disclosures. Sometimes the perpetrator makes a video of the molest, and it's discovered. Well, that child never disclosed. It got out. There was a quote-unquote disclosure, but it wasn't an affirmative disclosure by the child. So when we look at predictors of whether a child is going to disclose in your interview, right? We looked at some of the other things, the historical things, the relationship, the support of the caregiver, right? We looked at all those things. Well, another thing to think about is, how did they get into your interview room? Was it a purposeful disclosure or an accidental disclosure? Was it a child who went to the guidance counselor and says, I can't take it anymore? Will you help me? Or was it a child whose the cleaning lady discovered recordings of the molestation and took it to the cops? So the kid who purposefully tells, much higher correlation with a disclosure to you than the kid who makes an accidental disclosure. The kid who makes a purposeful disclosure is much more likely to disclose to you in your forensic interview than a child who does not make a purposeful disclosure. Any questions about that? Yes.
I have a question, more of like kind of piggybacking off what you were saying.
Yes, you have a question that's more like you're piggybacking off what I'm saying.
Not a question.
An observation.
Correct.
Okay. I'm saying it loudly so it records. Go ahead. I'm not trying to get in your face.
I work for
Go ahead.
I work for Reactive.
Yes, ma'am.
And I had a case, I still have a case where the child, it was an accidental disclosure basically. And the child was in school and she's in kindergarten. She went into the bathroom with another classmate and she was licking the other child's
Vagina.
Correct. And the school reported it, they ended up calling the division, and they ended up finding out basically later on that there were things going on in the home by her brother. And that was, how they found out, what was happening because of what she did in school with the other child. So.
Yeah, excellent. I mean, that's an accidental disclosure, and that's somewhat similar to the example I gave you, where age mates, little ones, are acting out in a sexualized way, or we'll look in a moment, a sexually reactive way. We're not so much investigating that for criminal charges or for sexual abuse findings for DCP&P, but we're investigating to find out, where that behavior arises from, whether it's learned behavior or whether they were exposed to something. And you're saying, upon investigating the matter, it turns out that one of the children was being molested by an older sibling. Yeah. And that child would be less likely to report molestation in your forensic interview than a child who made an affirmative, purposeful disclosure. Just to get back to where we were, You got the group that makes purposeful disclosures, and you got the group that makes it accidental disclosures. And when we're sizing up, how challenging our interview is going to be, that's another factor we look at. We looked at those predictors, the intrusiveness of the sexual abuse, the closeness of the victim and offender, the young age of the victim, the support of the caregiver, and you can add to that purposeful versus non-purposeful or accidental disclosures. And you know ahead of time, how to approach this interview, and that's getting back to what we were talking about here. I'm advocating for the informed interview. The more we know about the kid, the more we know about the case, the more we know about the abusive trauma that this child experienced, the more able we are to craft our interview in such a way that it speaks to all of those issues with this particular child, so we can make them feel better about telling and address whatever's going on in their head about the abuse. Now, this chapter just starts by talking about child development and its role. Many of the things I talked about, because it's in chapter 13, I wanted to address it. It's among your readings, but we'll pick up on as the weeks go on, all of this stuff. Back to the child development, certainly relevant stuff. There was one of your readings was about cognitive milestones, and I'm not going to go over this in any degree of detail, but this is the kind of thing we're talking about. We want to make sure that our interviews are efficient, that we spend the limited window of opportunity that we have focusing on things that children are able to do. Excuse me. And this is just a typical description of children's abilities at various ages. Okay? And a forensic interviewer needs to know that. You'll notice here between 5 and 6 it says counts to 10. But they use a word here called rote. That simply means that they can recite 1 through 10, that they do it more like a parrot, right? Rote means mechanical, right? Rote, 1 through 10 they can count, but they really don't have an appreciation of numbers, of sequence, of chronology. Those kind of things haven't developed yet. So be careful, simply because they can count to 1 to 10. Say, wow, this kid's sharp. Well, that's typical of someone their age, and it certainly is not an indicator of whether they can do any complex analysis of events that require an understanding of math. But here's where they begin to relate clock time to the daily schedule, 5 and 6. So this chart here, not chart, this collection of cognitive milestones addresses the milestones for kids right up to the first grade, basically. Now, you've got to read all those other things. I'm not going to go over them in class, but I'm going to go over the upshot of all this for forensic interviewers. We need to know as much as we can about child development, and I think I expressed why, and you'll talk more about it in your discussion boards, and you're going to talk about it in the context of all the readings. You'll learn here, and you'll talk to one another about why child development helps you. But at the end of the day, here's the kind of things that are relevant to forensic interviewers, right? Who, what, where, when, how many times, and circumstance. Circumstance is the context of what happened. What the heck happened? What are the details of what may have happened, okay? These are the typical questions that come up in forensics, in investigations for child protection or law enforcement. And you'll see 3- and 4-year-olds can't tell you how many times. The black part, most kids can handle. So most 3-year-olds can handle who and what, not much more. It's gray on where, and that simply means that some 3-year-olds can handle where, not so many, but some of them. And where it ends the bar, when, how many times, and circumstance, 3-year-olds cannot handle at all. Okay? 4-year-olds, most of them can do who, what, and where. Some of them can do when, And number of times in circumstance, you're still unable to handle those kinds of questions. 5 and 6, 7 and 8, 9 and 10, and by the time kids get 11 or 12, I mean, they can have a conversation almost like an adult with you. And more importantly, they're no more suggestible than adults at 11 or 12. When it comes to that issue of suggestibility that we've been talking about, it seems like week after week after week. Suggestibility, right? Mesmer, the witch trials, Freud, suggestion. Well, 11 and 12-year-olds are suggestible, so are you and I. But what I'm saying to you is once kids approach 10, 11, 12, they're no more suggestible than adults. It's not a children's issue, it's just a people issue by then. But in any event, so now we know what their abilities are, right? So we're not going to ask 5 and 6-year-olds how many times it happened. You can, but the strong likelihood is they're incapable of answering that question. And that is a function of normal child development. That's why, in part, it's important to learn about child development if you're a forensic interviewer, right? And if we want our interviews to be efficient, if we want our interviews to be designed to get the most information and the highest quality information, we don't want to be messing around in areas that children are incapable of responding to. You're just wasting time. And when you're dealing with 3 and 4-year-olds and 5 and 6-year-olds, you don't have very much time at all. Your window of opportunity with children in that age range is probably 18 to 20 minutes on a good day. What I mean by that is after 20 minutes, they're tuning you out, they're getting distracted, they got to go to the bathroom, they want to play, they want to get out of there. So efficiency means we're not going to waste time spending 3.5 minutes figuring out. They don't know how many times. Call your partner on I don't think she understands how many times. We know that. We don't even need to ask her. We know going in that kids up to 6 can't tell us how many times. So the more we know about child development, the better interviewer we are. Because we're not going to use our limited time to ask questions that are beyond the ability of our subject, beyond the ability of the child we're interviewing. And good forensic interviewers know this chart, and they make sure they abide by it. Yes?
Are they able to let you know if it happened more than one time? Like if you say, did it only happen once? Did it happen more than one time? Like can they do that?
Yes.
Or is that too much also?
Yes, and we'll talk about that, and that's the preferred way of asking questions when this is relevant. This chart addresses what the common questions are in an investigative interview. And traditionally, how many times something happened is the kind of thing that child protection workers and cops want to know. I don't even want to know that from adults if it's chronic abuse. Nor do I want to know when, and I tell my investigators that over and over again. But yeah, most kids, I'm not so sure about 3-year-olds, but it's worth asking. But I think most kids can appreciate once or more than once. And when we talk about the protocols that I endorse, and I think there's probably consensus around the country about this kind of issue, we ask once or more than once. That's what we do in forensic interviewing. And the cops should be okay with that. Certainly the enlightened prosecutors are okay with that. It may take a little bit of convincing for some prosecutors to appreciate that because they're so used to charging specific incidents on specific days, but it doesn't work with chronic abuse, and it doesn't work with children because they're not able to tease out those discrete events and express them in that kind of way. So yeah, no, that's a good question, and that's exactly what the kind of thing we recommend. And I don't know, it may be relevant. The exact number of times may be relevant in some context someday, I don't know, but it's important to know, when they're able, to talk about that. 3, 4, 5, and 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, and 12 have all different general abilities, and we need to pay attention to that. Even as recently as 2 weeks ago, I had one of our unit meetings, and I was, I have 3 or 4 new detectives. I'm reading the statements they're taking, and this wasn't even from a child. This was from a teenage girl. you know, and they're asking her how many times and you know, when it happened. And I even with the teenagers, even with adults, as a prosecutor who has the highest burden of proof, I don't care how many times. If it's chronic, chronic means it happened over and over again. You know, this kid told us an account of being molested by her father. It began when she was 8 in the car back at a Dunkin' Donuts, and you know, and then he fondled her for 6 or 8 months, so she doesn't know. She fondled her for a time, and then he began to put his hand in her pant. He did this and that. Eventually, it was intercourse, and that's my story. And this happened between 8 and 12. Forget about how many times. I don't want to know how many times. It's not important. I want to know generally what he did. You know, what it was like. What did he do? You know, I want to know the conduct he engaged in. Okay, not how many times. I don't even really care about when. You know, I don't. I care about what he did. You know, and what the context was of the molestation. And this focus, this emphasis on how many times, really sets the victim up for failure. Even the adult. You know, they'll say like 10 or 20 times. You know, well, if it was 10 or 20 times, then it couldn't have lasted 8 years, and some defense lawyer will start doing math. You know, and when they say that, it's always about or an approximation. I mean, it's asking for trouble that we really don't need. You know, and when it happened. You know, my colleague told me yesterday about a case, you know, made the hair stand up on the back of my neck again because the kid said, oh, you know, it happened one day when I missed school. And defense lawyer, you know, I care. As long as, you know, it happened last year, tell me about what happened. If it happened sometime last year, I'm okay with that. Now, the law imposes obligations on us about notice to the defendant, and there's case law on that. You may have read about or heard about or studied in Children in Justice, State in the Interest of KW. But we can worry about that later if we have to worry about that at all. But of course, the defense lawyers go run out and they find out the one day she was out happened to be when she was going to the funeral for her grandmother. Thus, it couldn't possibly have happened that day. Therefore, he's innocent. You know. How about the more likely thing that she just didn't know what day it was? It was a day that she wasn't in school. How about characterizing it as that? You know, maybe it was a holiday. Maybe it was President's Day and she didn't even know it. You know, but she says, no, it's a day that I was absent from school. So anyway, we're not concerned about that. I'm digressing. The point here, though, is with smaller children, we have to appreciate their abilities as they develop so that we can ask better questions during the forensic interview. Any questions about that?
Yes, you said so for younger children, the number of times the act occurred does not matter, it's just the fact that it occurred?
What I'm saying is that especially with younger children, but all victims of sexual violence that is repetitive, the law is not that narrow-minded as to demand that they able to tease out every discrete incident that occurred during the time period of the abuse. So, you know, I don't want to say that it's utterly and completely legally irrelevant. You know, it's relevant in the sense that people have certain expectations about what other people should remember. And people expect that a victim can talk generally about that. I don't think people or the law expects that they can pick out each and every discrete incident. And the law doesn't require that, okay? So I encourage investigative interviewers not to ask that question. Because in the vast majority of, in a chronic abuse case, remember I said about little kids. It is about little kids. They have a tough time saying how many times, regardless of whether it's chronic or not, if it happened more than once. Let's say it happened 4 times. You know, kids 3 and 4, they can't even count yet. So 3, 4, and 5, they don't have the developmental ability to tell us how many times. So I'm kind of mixing things up here a little. I apologize here. But they're both concerned how many times. A teenager can count, but it may have happened so often and so repetitively that they don't know how many times. And what happens is they give an answer. And they don't say, well, I'm speaking metaphorically, or I'm speaking about, or approximating the gist of, it's about, lawyers on the other side are going to hold them to that number now. And they're going to, like I said, they're going to do all kind of mathematics to see whether that number somehow undermines the credibility of their assertions. So the law doesn't require that we know how many times exactly in a case of chronic abuse. Not even the criminal law, and not even in New Jersey. And it is a difficult proposition for children under 6, let's say, because it's beyond their development, even if it was a manageable number of times. And with chronic abuse, how many times becomes even more problematic when it was repetitive and long-lasting. Then it is really difficult for even adults to tell us how many times. Nevertheless, investigators, right up until 2013, want to ask that question. I'm telling you, the teenage girl, the new detective's going, how many times did it happen? They don't know. They're not thinking about that this is chronic abuse, that question is nearly impossible to answer. I don't care who you are, man. It doesn't matter who you are, right? You could be a Harvard mathematician, you could be President Obama, you could be the King of Sweden. It doesn't matter who you are, forensic interviewer. If something happens to you, how many times did you brush your teeth last year? How many? How many times did you brush your teeth in August this year? How many? I want to know. Give me a number. No one. These kind of repetitive chronic things you don't know. You don't know. And it's not that big a problem, but it happens now and then. Especially, you'll see with little kids, they'll say 150, 62, like the prices at Walmart, $3.97. What's with that?
No, I was asking because when we did the risk assessment chart in Children in Justice, and we were rating, the risk of the offender, it had mention of number of times the act occurred. That's why I was asking.
Right, but they're not concerned in that scale, the register and risk assessment scale. They're not so much concerned with the number of times it happened between this guy and this gal, or this guy and this man, or whatever, these two people. A predictor of future sexual violence and future violence, for that matter, a good predictor is, how many victims there are in the past. So 1, 2, 3 more victims, the more likely to reoffend. So the guy here who only had 1 victim is less likely to reoffend than the guy who has 3 victims or 2 victims.
Okay.
Not the number of times that the event happened between A and B. How many times he molested victim 1.
Okay.
That's not what we're talking about there. And I know some people may apply the scale, and maybe some prosecutors somewhere goes, oh, I count the ones between, but that's not, I was on the team that helped develop that scale, and I know what we were thinking. I know what I was thinking, and I'm pretty sure I know what everybody else was thinking too on that issue, because it's, that's not a good predictor. What a man, it's typically a man, what a man did with an individual victim in an incest case is, if he molested his daughter 3 times or 53 times, that's not really a good predictor of future sexual violence. But if he molested victim 1 and then another, that's a pretty darn good predictor. But you're right, and to the extent that we're able to know how many times, then we can use that fact. If we don't know, and in the cases in which, let's say that was, what's your name, first name? Michelle. Let's say that was true, that the amount of times the perpetrator did it with the individual victim helps the Megan's Law prosecutors predict future dangerousness. Well, the only time I'm saying I'm giving everyone a pass in this world, in New Jersey, in my jurisdiction, on how many times. Well, look at the people I'm giving a pass on, the ones who were victimized so many times they can't count. So if we had to assess that number for this guy and this victim for Megan's Law, we'd get the file and go, oh, you've been molested from the 6th grade to the 10th grade. I mean, clearly this was many, many times. So if how many times between the perpetrator and a single victim was relevant, the only time we're not counting, so to speak, is when it happens so many times, it's impossible to get a count. So we would still be able to know the answer to that. I don't think it's relevant, but if we had to know, I think we'd know. The only time I'm saying to my detectives, don't worry about how many times, is when it happened between the 6th grade to the 10th grade, or it happened, throughout my high school years. It happened over and over again. Those kind of chronic, multiple, repetitive abuse, I say, don't worry about how many times. Don't ask. And if that were the situation, the Megaslaw prosecutor would go, oh, this happened for 4 years. That's, and then they could do their analysis. Again, I don't think that's a good analytical point. I think it's the other way, but if they had to, yeah.
Charges against that person, even if it was like 10, 15 years later, she remembered what the person did because another cousin was molested the same way. Is there anything they can do if the person that molested them left the state of New Jersey?
You sound like you're talking about a specific case now. If they're a cousin and they left the state. Anyway, I don't mean to be flippant about it, but listen, I got your question. And it addresses the statute of limitations, right? Your question is, if it happened a long time ago and they never told, but they want to tell many years later, can they do something about it? Is that the question?
Yes.
Okay. The answer is maybe, and probably more like probably, depends. In New Jersey, they abolished the statute of limitations for criminal cases in 1996. Okay? So, the question becomes, did the abuse happen before 1996 or after 1996? Hold it there. If it happened after 1996, that's easy, because there is no more statute of limitations, which means that if it happened in 97, a young woman can report it at 18 or 118. Prosecutors don't like to prosecute cases that are 80 years old, but the question is, can you do something? The answer would be yes. For cases that occurred before 1996, okay, then you have to see whether the victim could have prosecuted the case the day that they passed the new statute, whether they had a good case under the old statute. Now it gets kind of confusing here. Pay attention. The next question, well, what was the old statute? If I got molested in the 70s, before this 1996 new rule that gets rid of this rules, what was the rule in 1970? Well, the rule in 1986, we'll say, there was no rule in 1970. It was 5 years, like a shooting or a person actually had 5 years from the time of the crime in 1970. But in the mid-80s, they had a pretty progressive statute of limitations, and it went like this. You had 5 years from your 18th birthday. First it was 2 years in the early 80s, then they changed it to 5 years. And the legislature began to recognize that victims of childhood incest, the legislature, the lawmakers began to realize that victims of intrafamilial abuse, people who are victims of sexual violence within the family, they're in no position to report it when they're children. The problem is that they're children and they're being molested by the people who would drive them to the courthouse. So that's not going to happen. So the legislature said, how do we give them justice? And they said, well, when they turn 18, that's when they become adults. We'll give them 2 years after they turn 18 to find the courthouse door, so to speak. Then they changed it, we'll give them 5 years from the time they turn 18 to find the courthouse door. And that's the way it was for many years. So the rule before 96 was 23 years old, right? It was what's 18 plus 5? 23. So the rule was 23 years old. You had until you were 23 to make a complaint in the criminal courts. So now, back to your question, in 1996, they changed the law and said there is no more rule. Whatever age you want to report, you can. Were you less than 23 on the day they passed it in 1996? If you were 20 in 1996 when they passed the new rule that abolished the statute of limitations, if you were 20, you still had a good case, right? Because how long do you have under the old rule? Till what age? 23. So the day they passed the new law, did you have a good case? If you were 20 the day they passed the new law? Yeah. He said, hey, I read in the Star Ledger, they passed a new law. There's no more statute of limitations, but it says this only applies to people who could have prosecuted it the day before the new law passed. Geez, I wonder what that rule is. Oh, it says right here, 18 plus 5, 23. I'm only 20. I could have prosecuted this yesterday or today. So that person gets drafted into the new law. On the other hand, imagine a person who's 27. On the day, and they never reported it, on the day in 1996 when they passed the new law, it says there's no more statute. They were 27. They go, you know what, I finally have the courage to come forward. Hey, I read in the Star Ledger, there's no more statute of limitation. Mr. Police Person, can I file a complaint? How old are you? 27. Sorry, ma'am. Your cause of action expired 4 years ago. And the new law was passed today, you're correct, but you had to have a good case, prosecutable case the day they passed the law, but your case died. Once dead, you cannot revive a case. Supreme Court of State of Jersey. They tried to do it in California with the priests. They abolished the statute of limitations in 2002, right around here. And they said, we abolish it retroactively. And it went to the Supreme Court. I went to the United States Supreme Court. And they said, wait a minute, what you're doing is digging up cases for the past 100 years. You're reviving cases where the statute expired many, many years ago. And that was overturned, even in California. Very liberal. So you got to do the math. People come in all the time. I'm getting to the age where there's no more people left that I have to do the math anymore. Almost everybody is okay. But in the mid-90s to the mid-millennium, I had to do the math. How old are you? When did it happen? I have to figure out how old they were in 96. Now, it only applies to penetration cases. It doesn't apply to fondling. Fondling cases, it's still 18 plus 5. 23. So if, you know, step-uncle fondled somebody in the 80s, but they were 22 when the new law passed, doesn't matter. Their statute is 18 plus 5, 23. It only applies to the first-degree assaults. Yeah.
I know you said the statute of limitations was up, but what if, I'm saying the person, nobody ever knew until the child, she had a nervous breakdown, then we just found out that's what happened. And she was telling everything, it was like, that's how we found out just recently that something like that happened. And she was having details, but, and then when she came out with it, the other cousin said yes, because it was the mother's boyfriend.
Well, listen, I don't mean, we certainly can talk about this, or I can refer you to the right person to get an answer. But whatever your situation is, the question about whether they can go forward or not is what I think I answered. Is there something about that you can't apply to your story, that your situation? I'm sorry?
At least, like, she had a nervous breakdown, that's what we found out.
Okay, and the question of whether that case can go forward or not is governed by what I just said, right? If they're New Jersey residents. Anything else is, you know, a personal matter, and I'd be happy to talk to you about it. This isn't the right forum. And these things happen here. You didn't do anything wrong. We talk about these kind of things here, and sometimes it causes us to think about our own families and our own stuff. And that's okay, but this is, you know, not a good place to do that. So, like I said, if you call me, I can connect you with the right kind of person to talk to, or even give you some more legal advice from a prosecution perspective. But I think as far as whether someone got something that happened a long time ago can go forward today, I think I answered that as best I can here without asking personal questions. Okay. Any other questions about what we're talking about? All right, before we go, I just want to talk about sexual development, okay? There's the article that you had to read by Philip Rich, okay? And he talks there about children's sexual development. And that's something that we need to know about as well. Excuse me. No, we talk about children's cognitive development, we talk about children's linguistic development, we talk about children's sexual development. Sexually reactive children, he describes them, and some people use different characterizations these days, but I think this covers it for our purposes. Sexually reactive children are prepubescent boys and girls, that's kids who have not yet reached puberty, who have been exposed to or had contact with inappropriate sexual activities. Now, these sexually reactive children may engage in a variety of inappropriate behaviors for their age as a result of their own exposure to these sexual experiences. And they may begin to act out or engage in sexual behaviors or relationships that include excessive sexual play, inappropriate sexual comments, gestures, mutual sexual activity with other children, or even sexual molestation and abuse of other kids. So to sum it up, sexually reactive children are kids who were sexualized before their time. They were exposed to sexuality, human sexuality, in an unhealthy way, not in a normal way, okay? In an inappropriate way. They may have been molested themselves. They may have watched a sibling be molested. An adult may have exposed them to explicit pornography. So a sexually reactive child is a prepubertal child who has become sexualized, who has learned about human sexuality in an unhealthy, developmentally inappropriate way. Contrast that with what they used to characterize as playing doctor, or two children exploring their private parts or tickling one another. And, that may be sexually normal, and there may not be anything wrong with that. I mean, not that one would encourage it, but nothing unhealthy about it. This is different. This is where kids get it from grown-ups or some other child who was molested by a grown-up. It doesn't come out in a normal, healthy way. And Professor Rich argues that for all kids below 11, all forms of sexual exposure are considered inappropriate. Watching adults have sex, looking at pornography, excessive sexual play with a same-age child or older child who has more sophisticated knowledge. Any situation in which a child is exposed to explicit sexual material outside of an educational experience taught by qualified staff. Masturbation is a normal developmental process in children. Many children touch their private parts, masturbate, play with their genitalia. It can be disconcerting for the adult who sees it for the first time, but it happens. It's normal. There's nothing unhealthy or inappropriate about it. Now, if it's excessive, if it's painful or aggressive, then you may have a problem, and then you need to examine what's going on further. Mutual sexual play with the same age or child, as I said, may or may not be inappropriate. Depends on what they're saying, what they're doing, the intensiveness of what they're doing. Masturbation is normal unless it's excessive or obsessive, okay? Attempting sexual contact with older children or adults or even animals, a problem. And one needs to look further at that. Not an example of a child who is developing normally. Obviously, using coercion or aggression is a sign that something's wrong. It's not a sign of a normal, healthy sexual development. Engaging in sexual contact with younger children, not an example of sexually normal development. Tony Kavanaugh Johnson describes as follows a little bit of a primer on what to look for. Children should not be preoccupied with sexual play and should engage in many other forms of play. Children should not engage in sexual play with much younger or much older children. Children should not have a precocious knowledge of sex beyond their age. Children's sexual behaviors and interests should be similar to those of same-age kids. They should be able to stop when adults tell them to stop. And there's a number of examples there of inappropriate sexual behavior among children and signs of sexual disturbances. Now, what my colleague here from DCPP described earlier was an example of a sexually reactive child, right? In the bathroom at school, 2 children were discovered. How old were they about? 2 5-year-olds were discovered engaging in sexual conduct. Okay? And, you might say, well, you just said that kids, play doctor and do that. So we need to know a little bit more about it, but right at the beginning, the context jumps out at me. The bathroom, not typical. You don't spend a lot of time there. It's not the kind of place where normal, developmentally appropriate sexual conduct among 2 age mates might happen. Maybe in the backyard on a sunny day or something. They're in the yard playing. Their toys are there. It's a place that play is encouraged. Sexual play can be part of play. And that discovery of their private parts and the mutual exploration among age mates may be appropriate. But right here, I know they're 2 5-year-olds, right here the context is troubling. It's school, and it's in the bathroom. And I'm sure once more questions were asked and the more we learned about it, we were able to clearly understand that it was not normal sexual exploration and was sexually reactive and disturbing behavior. And the kind of things you look for is, like I said, if one was coercive or violent or intrusive, if they're just fondling or touching, you think about that kind of case. But if they're penetrating or they're using objects or someone's holding someone down, what they're saying at the time, all of the surrounding circumstances and facts can lead us to conclude whether this is normal sexual development or something different. And again, I said her scenario right off the bat, I'm saying in a bathroom at school is a problem here. Could be wrong. If you told me it was the backyard on a Sunday afternoon and they were in the playhouse, I'd say, all right, let's see. Probably much ado about nothing. We don't know. But here, not a good context. And further investigation revealed that one of them was indeed sexually reactive, which means that one of those children was exposed to sexual stimuli, before it was normal, before puberty, well before she should have been exposed to such things. And in fact, she was abused, right? Yeah. So, by her brother. So that's one way to be exposed to it, actually be abused. Any questions about normal sexual behavior in that article? Yes.
When it is child on child like that, and in this case, where it was a 5-year-old and a 5-year-old who was
Yes.
abused by an older brother.
Right.
How much older is the brother? And then where would you go from there? I mean, if, let's say the brother's 10, do we then investigate if something happened to him? I mean, where do you go from there?
Well, you want to find out what happened to this 5-year-old girl, and if it turns out that she reports that her older brother engaged in sexual contact with her, then we need to look at the context of that. You mentioned one contextual detail, age. If he's 10, we're going to look at it one way. That doesn't mean he's not the subject of law enforcement scrutiny and child protective scrutiny. 10 is 5 years older than 5, okay? So he's significantly older. I don't know what he did, but, we'll look at what he did. If it was penetrating versus fondling, if it was... we have to look at all the facts and surrounding circumstances to make a decision about a 10-year-old. And you're putting us, from a law enforcement perspective, you're putting us right at the line of where somebody can be held criminally responsible for their behavior. And if he reports, my uncle molested me, then we'll investigate the uncle. Yeah, it sometimes happens. Intergenerational abuse is, I don't want to say very common, but it's among the the case types that we encounter in child protection and law enforcement. I get grandpas and sons and grandsons, and they all molested. There's a history of molestation among each generation. Sometimes we uncover that. So yeah, we would go from the 10-year-old to whoever, if there was someone who molested him, we'd find that person.
Would there most likely be somebody else because he is only 10?
At 10, he's closer to, remember, sexually reactive is a pre-pubertal child who's exposed to sexual stimuli in an unhealthy or abnormal way. I don't know what he did, but assuming that he was licking her vagina, let's say, that's a pretty good indicator. You should know that at 10. You should know to do that at 10. So I will declare him sexually reactive. And that says to me, by definition, that he learned it from someone else. So at 10, I think it would be fair to say it would be normal to find that he was molested. Now, you know, with the internet and smartphones, and you know, there's a little bit more potential that 10-year-olds can stumble upon stuff. But whether they run or recreate it or not is different. You know, to even to be getting oh wow, and then go do it, it's a big leap. Even today, I would say. But I don't know. It's like I haven't studied that. The impact of modern technology and the ubiquity of pornography and its ease of access among, you know, 6th graders and below, but that's probably a good experiment to do. But I just from knowing what I know, it's one thing to look at it where you know, you're hiding it and you stumble on it, or all the boys are laughing and giggling or whatever. Not that I'm condoning that, but that's kind of the context where this would happen. And then going and do it to somebody. That takes a big leap there. And, you know, I still think that it's more likely that that kid was hands-on molested than he was sexualized by stumbling on pornography or going to pornography because it's easy to find these days. I just don't, it doesn't seem to make sense to me. That you then go act it out on a smaller child. Could be. Any other questions? Yes.
What about if the father do a sexual act in front of the child and knowing that?
Yeah, that would be an example of the child's exposure to that is inappropriate. It could be abusive if it was purposeful by the father, or reckless. It could be abusive. It could be criminal. And the child who's exposed to that chronically, more than once is enough, but you know, I'm not so sure what the impact of a one-time peeking in the door when he shouldn't have might have. But if a child's exposed to that kind of behavior over and over again, he could become, or she could become sexually reactive, that they were exposed to sexual stimuli before their time. And that would be an example. It doesn't matter whether some grown-up showed it to them on the computer or some grown-up left the door open on purpose or with indifference. We get a fair number of these cases where the kids are exposed, or sometimes the caregivers are having sex in the living room. Sometimes people live in very small locations, you know, not even a bedroom. There's not a door on the bedroom, but there is a door in the bedroom and there's somebody sleeping in there. They're having sex on a couch, and the kids are sleeping in sleeping bags in the corner. So it's not always as black and white as like the guy's in a room, and you know, it can happen in a variety of contexts. It can be equally damaging to the children, and equally important for there to be a child protection investigation and maybe a criminal investigation. But it's not always as stark a picture as I sometimes think in my head. You know, the guy's in the room, he leaves the door open and bites. Sometimes it happens recklessly. Sometimes you have women who are, I say women, you don't see with the men too much, who are turning tricks in the house. They're having sex with men for money. And the kids are there, and they know about it, or they watch it, or the mother's indifferent to it. And that would be an example that would be consistent with your hypothetical. But yeah, no, could be a crime, and it certainly requires a child protection investigation and intervention, because it can do nothing but harm to the child. Any other questions? Yeah, go ahead.
Do you happen to know that something that would be common to happen, or is it just certain cases?
You know, I don't know how common it is.
You know, obviously it happens, I'm just curious if, you know.
Yeah, but I do know this, that the perception by some members of the public that kids who get molested grow up to be molesters is erroneous. Many children are molested and never molest anyone else. And in fact, may be hypersensitive to the feelings of others and may have tremendous empathy. So some children, though, who are molested do grow up to become molesters and do grow up to act out sexually on vulnerable persons when they grow up. I'm just speculating, but I would think that the numbers are you're more likely to grow up never molesting somebody than to molest somebody. And what is confounding to people is it feels like there ought to be more. What I'm saying is, of all the kids in the world that get molested, most of them grow up and they never molest anybody. 10 million kids get molested in the whole world since the dawn of time. Most of them never molested anybody. So the prognosis is good. Some of them do grow up to be molesters. And what confounds people, or makes people think that it's not the way I felt, or, you know, geez, from what I see on TV. Well, the kind of thing we see on TV are the molesters. Scratch a molester, you will find a molested. Among the universe of molesters, many of them were molested. But you're looking at the wrong analysis here, right? You're looking at all of the molesters, right? If you could look at all the molesters, 1 million molesters. Out of all the molesters, most of them were molested. But that doesn't mean everyone who's molested becomes a molester. You're looking at the wrong sample here, right? Just because you go to the jail, right, and you go to the state county jail, if you went to the child molester wing, and you went from cell to cell, hey, how do you know I was molested next? She didn't. Well, that correlation flows that way. If you look at all the molesters, most of them, if not nearly all of them, were molested or report being molested as children. But that doesn't mean, that doesn't flow the other way. That doesn't mean that all the kids who were molested grew up to be child molesters themselves. And I think what makes the people overrate the potential for kids who are molested to become molesters is a mistaken or erroneous inference that we're drawing from thinking about how many molesters were in fact victims. Because the numbers are staggering. Out of all the molesters, nearly all of them were molested as kids. But again, that doesn't flip around. They're two different questions. The question about kids who were molested growing up to be molesters is fundamentally different from the guys who were in fact molesters being molested as kids. So we tend to overrate. But I would think most kids grow up, they don't molest anybody at all. Now, they're more likely to have a myriad of troubles functioning as adults. But whether they would molest another human being or not is not one of them. Any other questions? Yeah.
I have one. Is there a correlation between being molested and homosexuality?
I don't believe that there's a correlation between that, because is your question that I think it's clear that molestation doesn't cause homosexuality. Homosexuality is not caused by anything. But so I don't want to delve into dangerous territory here. I don't think it's an unfair inquiry to say, well, among the people who are molested, do they engage in higher numbers in same-sex partnerships because they mistrust men, or maybe, I don't know. It's a good question. I don't think that's an unfair question. I don't think that's a biased question. I don't think that's bespeaks a lack of respect for homosexuality. I think that's what you're asking, right? You're saying, is there among people who are molested, is there a higher frequency that they would engage in same-sex relationships than people who are never molested? And one theory that might say that maybe there is, maybe there's a distrust for the person who molested them. Most molestation is male on female, so the question would be, do women who were victims engage in same-sex partnerships with other women at a greater degree than is the norm among women who've never been molested? And does that arise from a distrust of men? Because they were exploited and betrayed and that kind of thing.
I only
I don't know.
ask that because I know an adult male who, is a homosexual and.
Oh, you're asking about man on man?
Right, and through his counseling sessions, it finally came out that he was molested as a child by a family friend, someone they trusted, it went on for a while. And this person is a homosexual, and I guess now they're saying that maybe that's what led him down this path.
Yeah, I don't think there's any research to support that. I don't know. We'd have to look into that, but I don't. The way I framed the issue before is quite different from what the question that you're asking is, and it really speaks to your feelings about homosexuality. Lady Gaga says you're born this way, right? So whether the man molested you or not shouldn't really affect that. But if it's a choice, I said when women seek out same-sex partners, carefully choosing my words there, you may find more same-sex relationships, I said. So it's a complex and thorny area. I don't know about that. I don't know of any research that says boys who are molested by men or priests or whatever grow up to be homosexual. I don't know that there's any empirical support for that. Well, we can always Google it, right? But I don't think there is. Any other questions? All right. I said we'd leave a little early. We'll leave a little early today, and I'll see you all here next week, okay?
For the discussion question, we can just put up our answer any time within these 2 weeks?
No, it says